Hello, and welcome to today's session. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Grote, Staff Systems Engineer here at VMware. Today we've got a really cool session, one kind of built out of some parts. And honestly, I think the session is kind of a mirror of the content that's in it. Today, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about application deployment ideas. We're going to be talking about Office 365 integration and also monitoring these applications. So why did I choose this? Well, we're going to start off with a whiteboard that I used to do with my customers when we were trying to decide how do we deploy applications. You see, not one size fits all. And technologies that try to incite that there's one solution for everything, well, we all know that's not the case. So VMware technologies, as always, are about integrating with existing ecosystems, leveraging your current investments, and allowing you to expand from there. So we're going to take a look at some ideas around how you might consider one application being deployed one way versus another application being deployed another. Then we're going to be joined by our very own Dean Flaming, who's going to be walking us through how to integrate Office 365 into VMware's Identity Manager portal. Being able to make these technologies widely available cross-platform. And that's also exceptionally exciting. And then we'll also have a chance to talk about what to do with the applications from a monitoring perspective. You see, it's not just about making the right decision up front and applying solution to a potential or perceived problem, but also integrating the technologies prescriptively and making sure that we're providing monitoring to ensure that those technologies and applications that were delivered are performing as expected and are scalable and are consuming resources within the data center as we want them to, and that we can ensure that we're going to be able to grow, build, scale, and also retract as needed as data center and consumer needs arise. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and start looking at application decisioning, Office 365 integration, and holistic monitoring of your application ecosystem. When we start talking about applications, it's important, I think, to try to evaluate how are the applications being used. For a long time, I have often attributed the fact that really application success boils down to the way that they're deployed and the way that they're used. And everything inside of, especially when you're talking about end user computing, really comes down to use cases. How are you using it? The way that the customer is using it is going to determine the best way to deploy against it. If VMware technologies are about anything, they're about the idea of integrating into existing ecosystems and then expanding holistically outward while leveraging existing investments. This is completely opposite from just rip and replace and apply a bunch of technology. The idea is to apply technology prescriptively inside of the right space. So let's just take a look at a little exercise that I used to do when I was out deploying end user compute solutions, and maybe it'll be of some benefit to you as we're talking about how we frame application conversations. What we would do is we would start by giving ourselves a grid, and the first column in that grid is the applications themselves. We would then, through a series of interviews, establish some use cases. We'd have, use case A, use case B might be an executive or something like that, and, use case C, maybe even marketing, who knows. We'd then go through, we would pull and determine the types of applications, and a lot of this is done through assessment. Be sure to check out the assessments that are available from VMware in this space as well as many others, and never forget, with most every end user compute deployment, you're going to be looking at one of the tantamount ideas for success is going to be assessment, assessment, assessment. Focus on that. Get a solid readout. Get really good information about what's happening inside of the environment now, because you don't want to really change what they're doing. You want to make it better. So let's say that we've got some applications that came back, and we've got maybe something like Firefox. Maybe Firefox was one of the applications that we saw installed a lot. Maybe another one was like MS Office, right? There's a typical one. And then we have applications that might be a little more esoteric, maybe something like, you know, Photoshop. So now we've got these applications. We get to decide now who's using them, how often, and we get to look at the information from the assessment and then go back and talk to the client themselves. So now we're looking at group A, use case A, and you know, we find out that inside of that group everybody has, you know, Office. Nobody really uses Photoshop inside of that group, but you know, a few of them do have Firefox for some specific needs. Then we move over here to use case B. Inside of this group, again, everybody's got Office because they need to communicate. And this inside of this group, we have really nobody needs you know, anything like Firefox because they're, you know, using pretty standard you know, browser, you know, applications. Then in use case C, maybe this is where we're marketing. You know, they're using Office as well, but they're also using Photoshop, and they're needing some of these other browser type applications. So they need a real full suite. So now that we've looked at, you know, our application stack, and we've looked at it one by one in a column perspective, now we're going to kind of twist around our conversation and we're going to look at the rows. So now, based upon the rows, we get to make decisions. You see here that something like Office is deployed on every single platform. So now you have decisions for how you want to deal with this effectively. Is this something where maybe you do a local install of the app, and you know, perhaps you know, remote for, you know, the files that it's being created, or maybe you stream this specific application, right? We don't know what endpoint it's going on to. Or maybe these are applications that you need to leverage, you know, technologies like maybe ThinApp or something like that for, because they can be thin-apped and we can leverage localized sandboxes for them, and we don't really have a lot of scope and number of people that we're trying to deploy to. So then we come up to something like perhaps Firefox. Well, we see with this one, it's not deployed everywhere, but it is kind of in a lot of places, and we could see that this might be something that we might need to turn on here or there. So maybe this is an application that we look at, you know, making available as a streaming app. It's fairly lightweight, and you know, we get to, you know, decide who gets it, or maybe we can provision it directly through end user computing portals. And then we have, you know, higher performance applications, things like you know, Photoshop, and we can see it's really not deployed much of anywhere. So then we have to ask the question, you know, what type of desktop is this user accessing? You know, is it you know, local? Is it you know, static, right? Dedicated desktop? Is it something that's going to be floating? Should we you know, install this directly to that specific desktop, or should we allow them to stream it or access it in another way? The point of the exercise is not to create something more confusing. It's to really expose the use case for the applications and how that use case is mapping back to the type of technology that we're using to deploy. Whether we're going to, you know, leverage, you know, something you know, kind of old school like ThinApp, or whether we're going to do, you know, a localized, you know, installation of an application, or maybe we're going to, you know, use app volumes because we have, you know, the need to create a stack, right, of applications. And this would be a perfect example, right? You could create an application stack out of that and then use a technology like AppToggle to turn things on and off. And we also have options, you know, maybe, you know, we have users inside of this group that are, you know, doing a lot with, you know, mobile devices, and for them, they want to use, you know, remote streaming because they need to be able to access Windows apps on iPads or Surface tablets or anything else. So through this, by looking at both a column and a row-based approach to our application evaluation, focus on the use cases, and then we can determine the best way to deploy each application into that infrastructure. And then we get to deal with how we're going to monitor them. And let's take a look at that now. So now that we've talked about the different ways and decisions that you might make when you're deciding how to deploy your applications, let's talk about expanding the scope of what we could do. I came across this fantastic video from our very own Dean Flaming. Dean's a great guy, always a joy to talk to, and crazy smart when it comes to end user compute. So when I found out that he had produced a piece of content that talks about integrating Office 365 into Identity Manager, well, I just had to bake that in. Now, this is very special, and it's part of a larger video that's available from Dean here. But in this segment, I'm zeroing in just on the integration and demonstration of what it's like to set it up. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a technical double click, but what we're going to see is the integration of really kind of a cloud-based Office 365 system into identity management so that our users are able to access all sorts of things. So remember the grid that we looked at a minute ago? Well, this is where we see more of that decisioning come into play. See, it's not just about packaging applications anymore. It's not just about creating application volumes or streaming an application. Now we have to have all of these different applications, whether they be, XenApp applications or SAML-based applications or URL-based applications. But we also have things like Office 365 and other cloud-based services that we have to integrate into this space so that users can get what they need, that they can federate into them, and that they're provided reliably and consuming what they need to at appropriate scale inside of the data center. So let's take a look at Dean's overview and introduction into the integration of Office 365 with Horizon and Identity Manager.
In this demo, we will walk through setting up Office 365 using the Office 365 admin portal, including setting up Active Directory synchronization and then integrating Office 365 into VMware Identity Manager. To start, let us first show the environment. On the right side, we have the Office 365 admin portal open and logged in. On the upper left, we have the Identity Manager portal ready for the user to log in. And on the lower left, we have the Server 2012 system, which will be used to synchronize to Azure Active Directory. Logging into VMware Identity Manager as the user, we see the user has no applications assigned. On the right side of the screen, if we shift tabs in the browser, we can see we also have the Azure AD Admin Console open and that no directories exist within the Azure or Office 365 tenant. It should be noted both the Azure AD and Office 365 consoles can accomplish the same functions. Additionally, administrators have the option of using newer beta consoles as well. Each of these consoles has an entirely different way of conducting the procedures needed here. Another thing to note, the Azure or Office 365 tenant comes with a default domain. In this demo, the default domain is flamenet.onmicrosoft.com. Additional tabs open in the browser are the Identity Manager Admin Console and Public DNS servers, as these will be needed for modifications. The first step is to activate the Active Directory Sync option within the Office 365 or Azure Admin Consoles. In the Office 365 Admin Console, click Manage under the Users, Activate Users section, then click the Activate button. In the Azure Admin Console, this option can be found under the Tenants Directory Integration tab. The next step is to create a domain in the Office 365 or Azure tenant. If using the Azure Admin Console to create the domain, ensure you select the box in the wizard to configure the domain for single sign-on with the local Active Directory. Here we are showing the use of the Office 365 Admin Console wizard to create the domain. After specifying the domain, the wizard will walk through three main steps. These steps are verifying the domain, adding users, and setting up DNS for the domain. After specifying the domain, it must be validated through the use of a TXT record or MX record made on the public DNS of the domain to ensure the domain is properly owned and controlled. Here we are adding an MS value to the front of the TXT record on the root entry of the domain. Once validation is successful, we can continue on. As validation may take some time, we will continue here with additional steps needed for integration. Our next step is to install the Azure AD tools on a domain member. Just prior to installing the Azure AD tools, it is recommended to run the IDFix tool to ensure the local Active Directory is properly configured and without errors. Any issues found may be fixed directly through the IDFix tool or through Active Directory users and computers. After validating Active Directory is without errors, the Azure AD Connect tools may be installed and ran. During the installation of the Azure AD Connect tool, the wizard will prompt for various configuration options, as well as connectivity information to both Azure Active Directory and the local Active Directory. Once this information is provided, the installation may continue. We will pause here before installing as the domain has not yet been created. Checking back with the domain validation process in the Office 365 Admin Console, here we see the domain has now been validated and we may continue the creation of the domain. As we will be synchronizing the domains, we do not need to manually create any users here, so we will be skipping the user creation process. Additionally, we will skip the public domain DNS management section as we already have public DNS properly configured. Back in the Office 365 Admin Console, we can now see the domain setup is complete. Taking a quick look into the Azure AD Console, we can also see the domain is created there as well. We can now return back to the Azure AD Connect tool wizard and continue the initial synchronization of users. While user synchronization takes place, we can shift back to the Identity Manager Admin Console and configure the Office 365 application. The main two items needed for configuration of the Office 365 application are the tenant domain and the tenant issuer. The tenant domain is the Office 365 domain which we just created. The tenant issuer is a globally unique value for Office 365, so we can therefore use the publicly fully qualified domain name of the Identity Manager tenant, as this is a globally unique value. After saving the application configurations, we must now entitle the Office 365 application to the user within Identity Manager. Refreshing the user session, we can now see the Office 365 application showing for the end user's session. Switching back to the Office 365 Admin Console, refreshing the active user screen, we can now see that all users in the local Active Directory are synchronized to Azure Active Directory. And switching to the Server 2012 console, we can see the Azure Active Directory Connect tool has also finished synchronizing. The next step is to use the Windows Azure Active Directory PowerShell command to connect to Azure Active Directory and validate the status of the new domain. After connecting to Azure Active Directory, we must convert the newly created Office 365 domain to a federated domain. As previously mentioned, this command needs to be built separately before issuing it with the Azure Active Directory PowerShell command window. When building this command, one of the most important pieces is the SAML signing certificate without the beginning and ending certificate notations or any carriage returns. When issuing this command, be mindful of any typographical errors, as you will receive an error or potentially misconfigure the environment completely. After properly issuing the command, we can rerun the domain verification command to show the domain properly validated as federated. Returning to the Active Directory Admin Console and refreshing the screen, we can see the domain is not only verified, but that single sign-on is also configured and end users exist there as well. The final step needed to complete this process is to assign Office 365 licenses to the Azure Active Directory user accounts. After completing this step, we can switch back to the user's Identity Manager session and launch the Office 365 application. Assuming everything is set correctly, this will launch the Office 365 home screen without prompting the user to re-authenticate, and the user can then execute any Office 365 application available to them.
So we see we've got a lot of different ways that we can approach how applications are deployed. It could be locally installed, they could be packaged, or they could be streamed. And they could be included in volumes or just streamed individually through something like a remote desktop. So we've got a lot of options and a lot of ways to deploy these applications, and we've got a lot of ways to integrate applications, as we've seen with the demonstration from Dean. Now, what do we do once we've made all these decisions? Once we've assured that the applications are where they're supposed to be, that they're going to become highly performant, and that we're going to be delivering them to the users that need them, and most importantly, we're fitting the use case. So what happens next? Now we have to figure out how to monitor them. We have to ensure that they're running as expected, and we're able to scale and shrink as needed. So this is where we jump into the monitoring section. We're going to be talking about vRealize operations, and specifically the integrations with the Hyperic technology. Now, this gives us a lot of out-of-the-box functionality, including some functionality with back-end mission-critical Office-type systems, things like SharePoint and Exchange, and we're going to be talking about those briefly as well. So whether you're looking to monitor processes or the applications themselves, this helps us get a holistic view of what's going on inside of the data center from an application perspective. Let's take a look. So once we've decided the types of applications that we're going to deploy, the modality and how we're going to deploy those applications, now we have to deal with a whole nother set of constructs, which is what do we do with the monitoring of those applications? How do we ensure that the applications are performing as expected, that we're dealing with things like change, configuration management inside of the VMs and inside of this infrastructure? Again, every time we're creating layers of abstraction, we also have to remember that monitoring becomes all the more important. We don't necessarily see the light go off inside of a VM. So things like operational management become all the more critical to the overarching goals of our data center. Operation system management is available inside of vRealize operations through the integration of Hyperic. And OS monitoring gives us support for very common OSs, things like Windows, Linux, Solaris, AIX, and it allows us to deal with things like auto discovery, CPU, memory, hard disks, network interfaces. And if you haven't seen the video on NSX, you should also check that out when we're talking about NSX and operational integration. We also get some remote capabilities and generic capabilities beyond that inside of the Hyperic integration. Things like looking for Windows processes and services, being able to monitor any process or Windows service that's running inside of the VM, and to have built-in key performance indicators and availability status for those particular processes. And then to be able to give us things like remote monitoring for ping, FTP, and SNMP, as well as HTTP and URL redirection type of monitoring. We have a lot of applications that are available inside of this. So again, when we're looking at the application stack and determining what we're going to deploy and where and how, we also need to evaluate the applications that are available to us, so that we can make the best decision for which ones are going to be monitored in which way. The Hyperic integration within Ops really gives us a tremendous way to, again, have insight, right? To give gauges to the car so that we know what's going on, and then to have the ability to triage and troubleshoot up and down the stack, to automatically create links and correlations from virtual machine to operating system, and then to dig down deeper and double click into specific applications inside of that space. It all starts with our integration and the assimilation of vRealize operations management into our data center. We get things like native in-guest resource configurations, being able to easily create new objects for services, and then to be able to build those objects into our overarching views of the data center. In addition, we also have the capacity to view some highly important, mission critical, industry standard type workloads, things like Microsoft SQL and Exchange. And we have out-of-the-box capabilities for them, so that now, where before you might not have had a lot of insight into an environment, and let's face it, a lot of SQL-based environments can be relatively complex, especially when you start dealing with witnessing and mirroring and highly available SQL configurations. These things are not easy, and they're not easy to monitor. Now we can bubble that monitoring directly up into what we're doing with vRealize operations. This is a tremendous step forward in what we're able to do and what we're able to bring to our customers' data centers. And in addition, we also have monitoring available for Exchange. And inside of this space, being able to look for mailboxes and CAS components and determining their relationship and correlation to the infrastructure as well as the virtual machinery. And to be able to have an out-of-the-box view for all of your Exchange sites and ensure that the health of those sites is as expected. Then we can go a step further and we can look at the virtual machines, we can look at the infrastructure to ensure that we don't have compliance issues. And then if we're running on top of NSX, we're also able to look at capacity, we're able to look at the network compliance and assurances to make certain that not only is the software stack running, but also the infrastructure and the network and storage components, all according to our compliance guidelines, best practices, tribal knowledge, and frameworks that we've implemented into operations, as well as these other forms of communication. Thanks for taking time to join me today. As always, I hope you found value in these sessions. We've got a lot of great content this quarter. Be sure to subscribe for more updates and videos, and follow me on Twitter for news and updates as they happen. We also have a lot going on inside of services here at VMware. Be sure to look into some of our great new services that are available. Things like the NSX Design and Deploy service, now available from VMware. And if you're a VMware partner, you need to look into our Partner Preferred Services program, where you too can deliver VMware services and learn from our services consultants and professionals inside of our professional services division, so that you can deliver and bring true value and the ultimate in VMware expertise directly to your customers as well. For all this information and more, be sure to follow me on Twitter, and feel free to reach out, and we'll also be able to get you the information you need. Thanks again. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again really soon.